Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 389. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I got some news on today's show dealing with Russia and China and how the Joe Biden administration is relentlessly pushing the world to the brink of nuclear catastrophe. I just want to remind people to share the show. You can find it on the Libertarian Institute, the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. And you can check out the show by following me on Twitter. I tweet out every episode at @KyleAnslone_. Let's get into it. All right, this is certainly the most important thing I have to talk about today. White House says it opposes a ceasefire in Ukraine. This from Dave DeCamp, March 19th, antiwar.com. The White House has come out against the ceasefire in Ukraine ahead of Chinese President Xi's trip to Moscow to potentially mediate between Russian President Putin and his counterpart in Kiev. Xi is due to arrive in Moscow on Monday and is expected to speak virtually to Ukrainian President Zelensky following his talks with Putin. Xi's trip comes after Beijing released a 12-point peace plan for Ukraine that called for the two sides to cease hostilities and for peace talks to begin. So interestingly, because the way the U.S. looks at this is that China is on Russia's side, which it is there's some fairness and truth to that. Xi and Putin have expressed that the relationship between Beijing and Moscow exceeds an alliance. However, China hasn't supported Russia in the same way that the U.S. has supported Ukraine. They're not transferring weapons. They're continuing their economic ties with Russia, which has been very helpful to the Russian economy. But that's far different than what the U.S. has been doing. And if you listen to rhetoric from the NATO side of this, Washington, Brussels, whoever else, they're saying that China can't be the party to mediate here because China hasn't condemned the Russian invasion. However, Zelensky expressed openness to China's proposal, but it was immediately rejected by Biden. And also in Moscow, the reaction to this was, we're at a phase in this war right now where peace talks really aren't on the table. Is the Kremlin's current position, if you listen, that they think that there is no side to really talk with, and that current demands from Ukraine are non-starters for Russia. So this is the statement from White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby, and this happened on Friday, according to Newsweek. Kirby said, "We don't support calls for a ceasefire right now. We certainly don't support calls for a ceasefire that would be called for by China in a meeting in Moscow that would simply benefit Russia." Kirby's comments came after Ukrainian and Russian forces continued to battle in the Donbass city of Bakhmut, which has become known as a meat grinder. Due to heavy casualties, Ukraine has been pouring barely trained conscripts to fight in the city, and the U.S. thinks Kiev is wasting too many resources in the battle. The U.S. wants Ukraine to launch a counteroffensive in the spring, although a senior Ukrainian official told the Washington Post last week that Kiev doesn't have the resources to pull it off. Kirby's reasoning for opposing a ceasefire at this time is that the pause in fighting could concede territory to Moscow. And if you have been watching this war, this is why I'm kind of confused, because after the fall offensive by Ukraine, it seemed pretty clear that the momentum had come to a halt and then reversed and is now on Moscow's side. So you would think that the White House would actually be supporting a ceasefire at this time, because it seems to me that at this point it's really the Ukrainian forces that really need to take time to regroup, to train, to get acclimated to firing their weapons. Apparently, we have reports for the Kiev Independent that some of these guys on the front lines, they're afraid to fire their weapons because of the sound. So, it's just wrong to throw people like that into battle, right? Like, if they can't even defend themselves, it's really, really messed up to send them to fight. And so, look, even from the Western perspective, eventually this war will resume. That, they're not done weakening Russia here. You would think they would support a ceasefire, because it would be, in a way, strategically advantageous for Kiev. But I do think the real concern in Washington is that they want to keep fighting this war as long as possible to weaken Russia. And, having a ceasefire now, Kiev may realize that, hey, look, Russia has gained some more territory over the past few months. We don't like this. We wish we still had it, but the ceasefire is a better situation. Ending this war is a better situation. Ceding this territory to Russia is a better situation than continuing to fight this war. And so I guess the White House is concerned that if a ceasefire took place, it wouldn't restart. And it's just terrible. So more comments from Kirby. He said the ceasefire would in effect recognize Russia's gains and its attempt to conquer his neighbor's territory by force, allowing Russian troops to continue to occupy sovereign Ukrainian territory. And of course, it would be another continued violation of the UN Charter. And while, the U.S. likes to make out that the problem here is China. Look, we've had Turkey and Israel, two very, very, very close countries to the U.S. Israel, Biden says the relationship between the U.S. and Israel is bone deep. And we had the former Israeli prime minister saying he had a deal almost done and the West wasn't interested in negotiating. Turkey, a member of NATO, had a deal almost done. The UN was involved in mediating that as well. And that was on the table. And Boris Johnson went to Kiev and told Zelensky, do not accept this agreement. And so, this is just becoming more clear with every single offer for negotiation, every single potential peace deal. The West opposes it. And it's not because, they're worried that Ukraine's going to get a bad deal. They oppose it because they believe that, Russia will continue to fight Ukraine, and that's going to ultimately weaken Russia and put the U.S. in a better position geopolitically. It's disgusting. I'm seeing this more and more. People are repeating this phrase that we used even prior to the invasion, but particularly once it started, that the Western policy was to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. And, more and more I see people saying this and recognizing that that is the policy. So, this is just more confirmation of that. Now, moving on, I think even this report kind of does the same thing. This from Connor Freeman, antiwar.com, March 17th. International Criminal Court issues arrest warrant for Putin and other Russian official. In its first international charges issued since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, the ICC, based in The Hague, issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Putin and another Russian official over alleged reports of kidnapping and unlawful deportations of Ukrainian children as well as teenagers, Axios reported on Friday. So the official other than Putin is Maria. I'm not going to try her last name. She's Russia's commissioner for children's rights, and the arrest warrant was issued over similar allegations to Putin. According to a report published last month by Conflict Observatory, a program supported by the U.S. State Department, Moscow is accused of systematically relocating at least 6,000 children from Ukraine to Russia. The report further claimed many of these children were taken to camps or other facilities where they were so-called receiving pro-Russian re-education. Some such facilities are said to be used for foster care or adoption in Russia and the Crimean Peninsula, which Moscow annexed in 2014. Moscow has been working to evacuate residents from Russian-controlled areas and elsewhere in Ukraine throughout the war, including during the lead-up to the invasion when Kiev massively escalated its shelling of the Donbass. According to the UN, Kiev's war against the breakaway republics, which preceded Moscow's invasion, resulted in the deaths of thousands of civilians. Russia is accused, however, of carrying out forced deportations and forcible transfer of civilian populations from occupied lands, which is outlawed by the Rome Statute, which established the ICC. Neither Russia, nor Ukraine, nor the United States are parties to the Rome Statute, yet the ICC president told Al Jazeera he feels this is completely irrelevant. He added that the court's jurisdiction over crimes committed in its territory of a state party or a state which has accepted its jurisdiction, and Ukraine has accepted the ICC twice in 2014 and then in 2015. The contents of the warrants are being kept secret, ostensibly to protect the identities of the victims. However, the ICC chief said the judge's chamber decided with this case to make the existence of the warrants public in the interest of justice and to prevent the commission of future crimes. Officials in Kiev celebrated the issuance of the warrants. Ukrainian foreign minister proclaimed that Putin and the other Russian official will be held accountable for stealing children. Ukraine's prosecutor general, enthused about the world, received a signal that the Russian regime is criminal and its leadership and henchmen will be held accountable. The ICC has no police force or any way to carry out their arrest. When asked if Putin should be arrested, the ICC said state parties have legal obligation to arrest a person in respect to arrest warrants issued. Though the fanciful idea of Putin's capture and prosecution at The Hague is virtually inconceivable, Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokeswoman argues Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute of the ICC and bears no obligations under it. She also said the court's decision have no meaning for our country, including from a legal point of view. The Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov called the warrants null and void. For her part, according to Russian state media, the official on taking care of children thanked the international community for acknowledging her efforts to rescue children from a war zone. So she basically said that, look, we're just moving these children to a safer place. Russia's response is not surprising, as Washington does not recognize the court either. For instance, in 2002, George Bush signed a bipartisan piece of legislation called the American Service Members Protection Act. That law, formerly known as the Hague Invasion Act, allows the president to order military action against the Netherlands, a fellow founding NATO member, to protect U.S. soldiers who have and officials who accused of war crimes from ever being prosecuted or taken into custody. During the Donald Trump administration, the U.S. sanctioned ICC officials for attempting to investigate American war crimes committed in Afghanistan. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo charged the court is an unaccountable political institution masquerading as a legal body. In 2021, the Joe Biden administration lifted those sanctions but railed against the ICC efforts to look into war crimes committed by U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, as well as massacres of thousands of civilians perpetrated by Israeli forces against Palestinians. Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu dubbed the ICC's decision as pure anti-Semitism and demanded the Biden administration maintain the Trump-era sanctions. Earlier this month, the New York Times reported that although the White House, State Department, Justice Department, and intelligence agencies favored providing information on alleged war crimes to the ICC, the decision was blocked by the Pentagon over concerns that a precedent could be set for U.S. troops to be prosecuted for similar actions. And then I think this is really the rub of all of it. The timing of the arrest warrants may stifle potential Chinese brokered peace negotiations, which could begin as soon as President Xi is set to meet separately with Putin and Ukrainian President Zelensky in the coming weeks. Beijing recently released a 12-point peace plan, which focuses on achieving a ceasefire, launching negotiations, respecting sovereignty, stabilizing supply chains, and a few other issues. When the ICC was asked by Al Jazeera if he concerned these warrants could prolong the war and risk damaging China's diplomatic efforts, which seemed to be making some headway, he responded by saying, "This is a political consideration. We are doing our jobs. We are a court of law, and we are acting on the basis of request of the prosecutor, which is an independent office, and we will do what is expected from us." So that was the article by Connor at antiwar.com. Moving on next. So we know the U.S. is opposed to talks, but, we are pro-military escalation. Slovakia joins Poland in sending Soviet-made MiG-29s fighter jets to Ukraine. Slovakia on Friday joined Poland, pledging to send Ukraine Soviet-made MiG-29 fighter jets, making the European countries the first two named members to provide the weapons to Kiev. Slovakia's prime minister said his country will provide Ukraine with 13 fighter jets. His announcement came a day after the Polish president said Warsaw will send 4 MiG-29s in the coming days and that more will be delivered in the future. And I have a lot of concerns about this. Like, if these planes are going to take off from Poland and then directly go and attack, Russian troops, even if they are flown by Ukrainian pilots, this could be a real problem, and lead to just huge escalations here. I mean, I really think, that this does put us in the point where, we have to really do something, because the we're getting close to nuclear war here. We're definitely getting close to direct war between NATO and Russia, which will likely go nuclear. I mean, that is the way that this is likely going to play out if we keep escalating the way we are. The Kremlin spokesperson, that's Dmitry Peskov, said the plans were an example of NATO members raising the level of direct involvement in the conflict, but Peskov also downplayed the significance, saying that MiG-29s will not impact the Russian war plans. The equipment deliveries naturally won't have any impact on the outcome of the special military operation, but it may bring some misfortune to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. According to Slovakia's defense minister, the country will be receiving compensation from its allies for sending the MiG-29s to Ukraine. Slovakia will be granted $213 million from the EU and unspecified arms from the U.S. worth nearly $750 million. The U.S. has been encouraging former Soviet republics who are in NATO to ditch their older Soviet-made equipment for Western-made arms. Slovakia signed a deal with the U.S. in 2018 to purchase 14 F-16 fighter jets to replace their MiG-29s, and the F-16s are expected to be delivered next year. Ukraine has been demanding F-16s and other Western-made fighter jets, but so far NATO countries have pledged to send no more NATO countries have pledged to send modern aircraft. But the provision of the MiG-29s is still a major escalation of NATO involvement. And as I've been saying on the show for some time, I thought this was going to happen, and I do think the F-16s will eventually come. But I thought that these NATO states with Soviet-era equipment will transfer their fighter jets first, and that's what we're seeing so far. All right, next up here from Dave DeCamp, U.S. officials think Ukraine's ammunition use is unsustainable. Ukraine is firing thousands of artillery shells each day in the battle for the Donbass city of Bakhmut, a place U.S. and European officials don't think is sustainable, the New York Times reported on Tuesday. Two unnamed U.S. officials told the Times that the Pentagon raised the issue of Ukraine's ammunition use in Bakhmut after a few days of nonstop firing. Ukraine's war effort is entirely reliant on support from the U.S., and the Pentagon has shipped millions of artillery shells to the country. The report is the latest example of Ukraine's Western backers expressing their doubt over Kiev's war strategy. The U.S. wants Ukraine to launch a spring offensive and stop wasting so many resources in Bakhmut. The U.S. and Britain are preparing to ship thousands more artillery rounds and rockets to Ukraine to shore up its supplies for a counteroffensive. A senior Pentagon official described these shipments to the Times as a last-ditch effort because Ukraine's Western backers don't have enough to keep up with Ukraine's pace. The U.S. and NATO allies were not prepared to support such an intense artillery war. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has acknowledged that Ukraine is using munitions at a much faster rate than all 30 members of the alliance can produce it. Western officials have big plans to ramp up production of artillery rounds, but it will take months before any significant progress is made. Ukrainian troops fighting in Bakhmut have told the media they are already fighting with severe ammunition shortages. Ukraine is also using a lot of people as fresh recruits are being sent to Bakhmut, which has become known as a meat grinder. Ukrainian President Zelensky and his top officials have decided they will keep defending Bakhmut despite the dire situation for the soldiers on the ground. All right, we do have a little bit of good news on today's show. Not all the time, but we got a little bit here. Ukraine, Russia agreed to extend Black Sea grain deal. All right, and here's the good news. Turkish President Erdogan announced Saturday that the deal between Russia and Ukraine allowing the export of grain from Ukraine's Black Sea ports has been extended. This deal is of vital importance to the global food community, Erdogan said. I think Russia and Ukraine, who don't spare their efforts for a new extension, as well as the United Nations Secretary General. The deal was first signed in July and was brokered by Turkey and the UN. It has been a success in allowing safe passage for grain ships through Ukraine's Black Sea ports that has been heavily mined when Russia first launched its invasion. According to Al Jazeera, over 11 million tons of agricultural products have been shipped from Ukraine's 3 Black Sea ports under the deal. Russia and Ukrainian officials gave conflicting claims on how long the extension will last. Moscow said it was 30 days. Kiev said it was 120. The agreement was renewed back in November for 120 days. But this time, Moscow said it was unhappy with some aspects of the deal, so went with a shorter renewal period. Part of the agreement was a pledge by the UN to work to ease Western sanctions that impact shipments of Russian agricultural goods. Moscow says not enough has been done. And so that is the unfortunate thing. A lot of what's going on here is relying upon the West to do something here that's not antagonistic or making the situation worse with Russia. And the Biden administration seems incapable of doing that at this point. So I hope that happens, but I think in the long run, ultimately, the West will end up killing this deal with their sanctions on the Russian shipping industry. All right, next up, I wrote this article for antiwar.com. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said Ankara would improve Finland's NATO application before the country's May election. Erdogan made the announcement after meeting with the Finnish president in Ankara. Finland submitted a joint application with Sweden to join the North Atlantic Alliance last May. While most members of the alliance wanted to expedite the membership of the Nordic countries, Turkey has resisted due to Helsinki and Stockholm support for Kurdish groups that Ankara views as terrorists. In June, Turkey signed a trilateral pact with the two Nordic countries that would see Sweden and Finland join NATO. However, Ankara has repeatedly said that it could not admit the two countries into the alliance because Sweden was not living up to their end of the agreement. Recently, Stockholm, Helsinki, and Ankara suggested that Turkey could approve Finland's NATO bid without Sweden's. The Finnish president said that the Swedish membership was critical to Helsinki, telling Bloomberg Finnish NATO membership is not complete without Sweden. On Friday, Erdogan said, "We decided to start the ratification process in our parliament for Finland's NATO membership. As Erdogan's Justice and Development Party controls Turkey's legislature, the approval is expected to pass. If Helsinki is accepted into NATO, it would double the border between Russia and NATO. Moscow has indicated it does not see the Nordic states joining NATO as an issue unless the alliance deploys more military infrastructure to the territories. To become a NATO member, all existing member states must give approval. 28 30 states have endorsed the Nordic states joining the North Atlantic Alliance. In addition to Turkey, Hungary has not given approval." So on that last piece of Hungary, I've talked about this before. I don't think Hungary wants to draw the ire of NATO by being the one country that doesn't approve the membership. I also don't think Hungary wants to go out of their way to upset Russia and approve NATO membership if Turkey isn't going to do it anyways. So I would expect Hungary is going to go ahead and at least approve Finland's NATO membership in the coming months. Now, two other things I just want to mention. Of course, we've gone over this in the past that, Russia says that Finland and Sweden joining NATO is different than Ukraine joining NATO, and it's not going to be as big of a deal, right? Like NATO membership is what ultimately pushed Putin to decide to invade Ukraine. But what we are, hearing about the Nordic membership, it doesn't resonate the same way with Russia. They don't feel like it presents the same level of threat. Of course, unless the U.S. starts deploying like strategic assets to the country, then that's going to become a major problem and probably lead to military buildup in the region. Now, I have been wondering if this would happen, that, Erdogan would feel like he had to make some concessions before that election, or the West would attempt a regime change in Turkey. So it looks like maybe he's making sure he has goodwill, that we don't feel the need to mess with Turkey's democracy too much and change the outcome of that election for maybe a more pro-NATO leader. All right, next up. All right, this from Dave DeCamp. Serbia Kosovo leaders discuss EU plan on normalizing ties. And so this looks like a little bit of good news again on today's show. I'm not as familiar with this conflict as other conflicts that I cover. So I'm just going to say, the two countries met in North Macedonia to discuss a deal put forward by the EU to improve ties between Belgrade and Pristina. Kosovo formally declared its independence from Serbia in 2008, but almost 10 years after the 1999 NATO bombing, campaign that separated the territory from Serbia, but Serbia and many other countries have never recognized Kosovo as an independent state. Under the 11-point deal put forward by the European Union, the EU, Kosovo, and Serbia would agree to resolve disputes without violence and wouldn't block each other from joining international organizations. Both Serbia and Kosovo seek EU membership, and Brussels wants them to mend ties before joining. The deal would also result in de facto normalization by requiring each country to recognize the other nation's symbols and official documents, including passports, diplomats, license plates, and customary stamps. The EU plan would also allow some degree of autonomy for Kosovo's ethnic minority Serbs. The deal calls on both governments to assure appropriate level of self-management for the Serbian community in Kosovo and ability for service provision in specific areas, including the possibility for financial support for Serbia. Tensions often flare between ethnic Serbs who live in northern Kosovo and don't recognize the Kosovar government. Following 12 hours of talks between Kosovo and Serbia, the leaders of both countries said good progress was made, but a final deal was not yet signed. Kosovo blamed the Serbian side for a lack of a formal agreement. All right, let's move over to the Asia Pacific before we wrap up the show. U.S. intelligence official says China preparing for a war it doesn't want to fight. A DIA official assessed that China's growing pessimism over its relationship with the U.S. is making Beijing prepare for a future war it would rather not fight. China does not want to start a fight with us over Taiwan. Doug Wade, the head of the DIA's China Mission Group, said they will if they have to, but they haven't ruled it out. And this is what we've been talking about on the show. China wants peaceful reunification with Taiwan. That's very clear. The U.S. is, essentially making Taiwan its own independent country with a modern military. And this is something that's going to make it so Beijing sees peaceful reunification as impossible and then will fight a war to reunify with Taiwan if it has to. Last up here. Japan and South Korea are working to rebuild military ties with the U.S. backing. And this is something else I have been talking about on the show for probably about a year. Kim Jong-un has been screaming about this in North Korea, saying that the U.S. is essentially creating an Asia NATO here. And while the U.S., of course, sees it as strengthening ties against China, this is really going to escalate ties with North Korea, who today, I believe, are carrying out a simulated nuclear response to a U.S. nuclear attack. So escalations all over the world. And as I said on the last show, the Biden administration, I think, could really find themselves in a war that they intentionally get themselves in with Russia and China, but also not really how much they've escalated tensions against North Korea and how close we are to conflict on the Korean Peninsula. All right, everybody, with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll be back with more shows later in the week.